My name is Ty Scott, for those of you who haven't met me yet. I'm the one that is sending you all the emails and trying to get everybody through our doors and meeting people. That's one of my passions. Today we have Dr. Campbell, but before I introduce him, if people could just check their mobile phones and put them on silent. Thank you. Also, just a little bit of housekeeping. If we have any rumbles or tumbles or anything lit on fire, we're going to be going out this door here or back where you came from, the main doors. If anybody needs to use the facilities, they are just straight across the hall, and you can exit the room from the back door today. Great. So we're welcoming Dr. Campbell. I told him that I had done a little bit of research on him before he arrived. And he is a local Christchurch boy. He's been making some waves locally here in New Zealand, but also in Australia, where they tried to pinch him, just like they pinched the Pavlova, but we have gained him back onto these shores, and I think we'll be all the best for it. Dr. Campbell's alma maters are the Christchurch Boys High School and also the University of Otago, which is my favorite university because it's where I met my husband. And he studied genetics at Otago and gained his PhD in cancer and viruses there. He's lectured at the University of Sydney while working as a scientist at Children's Medical Research Institute of Sydney. He then went on to become the Deputy Head of Research of MS Australia, which is where he brings a lot of expertise for his talk today. He also has volunteered at our street appeal, so he has championed our services, and for that we really thank him. And currently he's running for a political seat with the National Party, but today he's here to talk to us about research in MS. So if you guys could put your hands together and give a warm welcome for Dr. Campbell.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ty. It's actually great to be here. I was once told when I started in the MS field is once you enter the MS field, you can never leave. And I think that is probably right. The other thing I will say is us scientists have a bit of a reputation as being as entertaining as goldfish. So hopefully it's not too dry. So I did entitle my talk Unveiling the Mysteries of MS, an update on MS research. Which was fine till I started putting the slides together and realised that's probably quite an ambitious task. So anyway, we'll see how we go. Ty's covered a little bit about my background, so I just thought I'd do a quick whiz through my bio. So I did do a PhD down at the University of Otago, which was looking at cancer and viruses, and actually was engineering adenoviruses to attack tumour cells. Now, that probably doesn't mean too much, but of course adenoviruses were the backbone of a lot of COVID-19 vaccines around the world, and we actually had that technology here in New Zealand in the early 2000s. Unfortunately, that lab that I did my PhD is now collecting dust, and it has been for probably the last 10 to 15 years due to the lack of funding. So that's one of my frustrations, and that's probably one of the reasons why I'm ending up down the path which I'm doing now. And you'll probably hear some of my other frustrations in the MS field as we go through this talk. I then went over to Sydney, where I worked at a place called the Children's Medical Research Institute, which was on childhood cancers, and then working in that field, end up kind of getting into the immune system and kind of really what causes the immune system to go awry and attack our own body. So it's really kind of what was the fundamental drivers of autoimmune disease, and that then of course led me into MS, which is predominantly an immuno condition. And it's my frustrations in access to pharmaceutical interventions here in New Zealand is the other reason that's kind of really driven me to try and enter into politics, to hopefully have a bit of a sway over that. I also did do a bit of teaching in the data science field. So some of these images are created by artificial intelligence, so they're not necessarily that accurate to life, but that is probably a fairly good description of what a virus actually looks like. So what I thought I would do is actually go back through the fundamentals of MS, and I appreciate people living with the disease probably are probably very familiar with some of these things. But if we can just kind of have a fundamental introduction, then we can work on some of the things more complicated and see where we're going. So of course, multiple sclerosis means many scars, and it arises when the immune system attacks the brain and spinal cord, and it is the most commonly acquired neurological condition in young people. Now, this was a slide that I used up till the end of last year, and I appreciate, because I was working for an Australian organisation, it is in Australian numbers, but we can translate that to New Zealand. And so up to the end of last year, we were saying there was 25,600 Australians living with MS. But one of the last things I did as the Deputy Head of Research for MS Australia was commission a study looking at increasing, really re-evaluating that number, and we found that when we used the 2021 data, there'd been a huge increase, and there was now 33,335 Australians estimated to be living with MS, and that was a huge increase of 30%. Now that's actually in keeping with a huge increase from 2010. So what we've seen is this gradual increase of the number of cases of MS in Australia, and that is mirrored around the world with other studies as well. So it suggests that the real number of people with MS is actually increasing. Now, a lot of people will say, well, is that because we're treating it better? Are we diagnosing it better? But of course, between 2017 and 2021, we probably haven't really changed our diagnostic criteria nor our treatment. So I actually think that that's a real increase in the cases of MS. And that's mirrored by other autoimmune diseases too. We're seeing an increase in autoimmune diseases. So I think that's something to be of concern, and we'll talk about the causes of MS as we go through. Now, the average age of diagnosis is between 30 and 40. Probably most people in the room would probably already know that statistic, but there is also cases of pediatric MS, and I think probably one of the patients or people living with MS that I'll never forget was a 16-year-old girl who had MS for 2 years, and she wanted me to come to a school assembly when she came out to her class. So yeah, I will never forget the bravery that she showed. So she wanted me to come along and have something to support her, and of course answer all the questions that her classmates didn't have. There is also later onset MS. It doesn't, if you escape out of 40, doesn't mean you're necessarily in the clear. Can be diagnosed in 70s and 80s, so really at any age. Now, a really stark point is that out of four people diagnosed with MS, 3 will be female, and this is consistent with other autoimmune diseases as well. So this could well be kind of a key to understand some of the drivers of MS. Now, of course, probably most of you have probably seen what an MRI looks like with someone with MS. So here it's probably not overly clear, but you can see the lesions in the brain. So this is kind of sites of inflammation where the immune system is attacking the brain. And of course, for MS, we talk about difference in time and space. So if there's just one spot in the brain, you have clinically isolated syndrome. If you have multiple, then of course it is clinically defined MS, and that's a definition we'll use later on. So what's actually happening? Well, it's really, here we have a neuron with a long axon, and these are important for sending signals from your brain to your body, and they're coated in what we call myelin, which is an insulating sheath, and it's also very protective of the neuron underneath. And what happens is the immune system attacks that layer on the outside and damages it. And so it's a bit like stripping the insulation off a wire. So you send a signal down a wire, if it's got no insulation, of course, you can have cross circuits, you can have shorts, or the signal's not going to get down. So really, that's a very simplistic look, but that of course leads to a number of symptoms, and I think probably people in the room are probably very familiar with the symptoms of MS. But a lot of people, of course, think about mobility, but of course there's a whole range of symptoms, because our brain controls absolutely everything we do, and of course it controls how we interact with the world, what we feel, and then how we respond to that stimuli. So fatigue is probably one of the most common symptoms, and then of course a lot of vision symptoms. There's probably a quarter of people are picked up with visual symptoms So there's a whole range of things that can be affected by MS, but I don't think I'm telling this audience anything new. Now this is an image that's come from what we call the Brain Health Report, and it's been an international document that's been endorsed by a number of MS organisations around the world. And so here, when we look at time, we talk about clinically isolated syndrome. So that's the first MS-like attack. So you don't fully have MS, and this is before what we call the prodrome. So a lot of people will probably after they've been diagnosed, look back over time before that diagnosis and suddenly kind of realise there's probably symptoms that have been happening all along. And so we call that the prodrome. And then of course, 70% of people that have CIS will then go on to form relapsing remitting MS. And of those, if left untreated, will probably progress into what we call secondary progressive MS. And just what I'm going to bring your attention to, the relapsing forms of MS we have some medications for, and there's very limited therapies available for progressive forms of MS. It says here there's no therapies approved worldwide to treat progressive MS, but we are actually seeing them coming on board now. Australia has approved Amazing for secondary progressive, and also ocrelizumab for, or Ocrevus as its trade name, for primary progressive MS. But most of the treatments really work in this boundary here for progressive MS, when it still relapses. So if we look at the course of disease, typically, of course, 75% of people will have relapsing remitting MS, so of course will come with relapses followed by periods of remission, and then as damage kind of accumulates, we end up into progressive forms of the MS, and these can be associated with lesions, but we can also have silent lesions which happen in the brain as well. So that's MS. How does it actually arise? Now, a lot of people kind of say, well, you don't really know how MS arises, what causes it. And at an individual level, we don't, but at the population level, we probably do. It's an interaction between our genes and our environment, which leads to the formation of MS. And so we talk about risk factors for MS. So these are factors that don't actually cause MS, but they increase your risk of developing MS. So, of course, your genetics is probably number one, but I do just want to point out that if you have a parent who has MS, you have a 1 in 100 chance of developing MS yourself. So the majority of children or people with MS don't go on to form MS. They have an elevated risk of developing MS. We've talked about gender. That's a huge risk factor in developing MS. And then we've got Epstein-Barr virus, which is a huge risk factor as well. And I'll just point out the kind of key here. We've got two columns. We've got the risk of MS, so this is the risk of actually developing MS, and the next column is the risk of the disease getting worse or progressing. So Epstein-Barr virus, I actually think this is probably a key step in the development of MS, and there's been studies on military recruits in the US, and I think there's about 10,000 people that they followed and kind of showed the importance of the Epstein-Barr virus. So this is the virus that causes glandular fever. So 95% of the population have been affected by this virus, but pretty much 100% of people with MS have been affected by the virus, and it could be around the way the body then reacts to it. Low sun exposure, low vitamin D. Smoking is a huge risk, both for the development of the disease and progression of the disease. Diet is quite important, but probably is not as strong as some of the other risk factors. And then high body mass, and then stressful events. So there's a whole range of things that kind of contribute to the formation of MS. And so one way that we can look at it is that for each individual, you need to have a number of risk factors before you develop MS. And we often talk about a threshold or a pie model. So if you need to get a complete pie to develop MS, each individual person's pie may be made up of different segments. So I've tried to kind of illustrate it here. If this was an individual, genetics has played a huge role in them developing MS, and then with the Epstein-Barr virus, it's added a huge bit of the pie. And then the rest of the pie could be a range of different risk factors. If we look at the next individual, maybe genetics only made up a little bit of the pie, and there was a whole lot of other risk factors that then caused the formation of MS. So for each individual, it's very hard to know what has caused MS, but we know on a population level there's a number of risk factors that we have identified. So I thought I'd put on a bit of a timeline to see where we're coming and where we're going to, where we're coming from, where we're going to. So it was first described as a distinct condition back in 1868, so it's actually probably quite a while ago, but it wasn't really till 1996 that we came up with the first treatments for MS. Now, I refer to some of these treatments as disease-modifying therapies. So these are therapies that actually change the disease course. There's other treatments which are actually just treating the symptoms. So there's this bit of a differentiation there. So our first injectable was in 1996. The first infusion was in 2006. Here we had some Australian studies looking at some of those risk factors that we're talking about. It was a very important study. Then we had a first oral treatment in 2011. We had the first kind of treatment that looks at remyelination. I'll talk about that later, but that was 2017. And here we have some more treatments coming on board. And see, once again, I'm just highlighting out there, over that time period, we've had a lot of increase in the number of people with MS. So the therapies have come along really fairly recently, since 1996, and we probably have made more progress in MS than any other neurological condition. And I was actually talking at the end of last year to the chief neurologist at a fairly large MS clinic in Melbourne. And he just passed the comment is that we don't actually expect any of our patients who are diagnosed today will end up with secondary progressive MS. And I think that is an amazing kind of progress really for over the last 15 or so years. Now this is a fairly busy slide, I will appreciate, but really once again it's showing the number of medications and the timeline in which they've been developed. And that, if you compare that to many other diseases, that is a rapid progression. We've started off with injections, we've got infusions, we have oral therapies, and actually this is the top above. The blue ones are the ones being approved by the FDA, and the ones down below are the Europeans. And actually there's been one or two more that probably, if you're looking at the Australian context especially, you'd probably find there's been about two more onto that. And when we look at the New Zealand context, this is a screenshot from MS New Zealand's website. We can see we've got limited access to a number of medications here in New Zealand. So once again, we've got some disease-modifying therapies. Down here we have some symptom management and some other disease-modifying therapies, but you can see they're not funded by pharma. So in Australia, there's 15 of those medications are subsidised by the government. So the very first signs of the disease, when you have CIS, you can walk into your neurologist and say, I'll have that one, thanks. And you pay a $40 prescription and you have access to which one you would like. Now the importance is everybody reacts differently to these medications. So not all medications are going to work for everybody. So it's very important that we have as big a tool chest as possible when it comes to treating people with MS. And I think here in New Zealand, we can actually do better. And that's the kind of second major frustration I have with the way we treat MS here in New Zealand. But I won't labour that point too much. So what do these treatments do? So if you remember this slide from earlier on, we have these neurons where we have the immune system attacking the myelin sheath. Well, a lot of these medications, what they do is they're very specific and take out certain parts of the immune system, which is actually producing the antibodies that are attacking the myelin. So if ocrelizumab is a prime example, it's an antibody. When injected into the body, it then goes and finds the B cells are producing the antibodies and takes out very specifically that subclass of immune cells. Now there is hematopoietic stem cell therapy, which I appreciate is a little bit controversial, but what it does is it actually just annihilates all of the immune system. And so the stem cells are actually there to replenish the immune system rather than actually repair any damage to any other parts of the body. So we've had great success in actually modulating the immune system. And the other thing is all these drugs have pretty much come from the cancer space, because a lot of lymphomas and leukemias, of course, arise from the immune cells. So that's how we've been able to make such progress so quickly. It's because we've been able to repurpose a lot of cancer drugs into MS as well. So where to from now? And I've kind of split it up into kind of three different kind of distinct areas. So where's the research going? Well, I think kind of people would pretty much agree that we need to continue working on finding cures for MS via repair and regeneration. And I've deliberately used the word cures rather than cure, because MS is very, very disease, so it probably is not just one cure which is going to cure everybody. It's probably going to be a whole range, and of course cure means something different to everybody. If you say cure to some people, they might think that it's the disease is going to stop and there's no more progression, or some people might think it's going to be reversing of the condition. So we have to be very careful when we use the word cures, because it does mean different things for different people. And also the other thing that I'm very careful about is the time frame. I think probably everybody who's read something has probably read that it's going to be within 5 years, it's going to be within 10 years. There was a person that did a lot of work with MS, and she said back in the 80s she went to the library and read a book that said that the cure for MS was going to be in 10 years' time. So I'm always very careful about timeframes. I think the other thing that's very important is prevention of MS. Of course, if we can stop people developing MS in the first place, I think that would be very, very beneficial. And also, since the incidence and prevalence of MS is rising so quickly, we really need to kind of get on top of what's actually causing MS. And I think I've said to some of you as you walked in, I think probably once we crack the nut for MS, it's going to be the Rosetta Stone for a whole lot of different autoimmune diseases. And then, of course, we need to have better treatments and management of MS. Now, I appreciate the next couple of slides probably display some of the bias that I have to the areas of science that I probably have favour. And one of them is actually, we need to actually have better understanding of what causes relapses. So at the moment, we can't predict who's going to have a rapid progression, who's going to have a lot of relapses, who's going to have a very benign course of disease. Now, interestingly enough, there's probably 280 odd Australians are going to die this year with MS-like lesions in their brain, and they will have never known. There's probably about 5,000 Australians walking around, and I appreciate this is Australian, there's probably 5,000 Australians walking around with MS-like lesions in their brain, and they don't know about it. So there's a huge pool of people which probably have a very benign sort of disease. So it's trying to work out what's actually going here. And this is actually an infographic that I put together to try and get some money out of Google back in 2018. They didn't want to put in $1 million, so anyway. But really basically what it is actually trying to monitor disease progression. We have smartphones, we have wearables that actually track our every movement. It's used a lot in fraud detection to kind of detect that phones are used slightly different. But of course, we can use that in the case of MS. If there's a bit of a tremor, if people are walking slightly slower some days, if they're walking a little bit unsteady, if there's some of those very small kind of symptoms that we can measure very accurately, we could potentially detect subclinical disease. And if we could then change the treatment, if we know the subclinical disease, we can get on top of it before there's a big relapse, then of course we'll be protecting that person. So the other thing that's a big problem, and the reason why progressive disease has been such a hard nut to crack, is we actually have no measure of disease progression. I know that sounds really silly, but we can look back over time and say someone's progressed. But we don't have real-time measurement. So once again, a platform like this, where we're going to take wearable data, take clinical data, take patient-reported data and take health records and put them all into one big database. With data science and things like that, we can then get actionable data, so then we can say, right, this person's progressing, we need to change disease, and so we can use our toolbox more efficiently, but we can also use a platform like this to develop more treatments for progressive MS. Because progressive MS is kind of a big unanswered question. And here we have a picture of an Epstein-Barr virus. And there's a group in Australia, what they're doing is they're taking immune cells from people with progressive MS, taking them out of the body, retargeting them to the Epstein-Barr virus, and putting them back in to see what sort of effects it's having. And what we're seeing is we're seeing very promising results in kind of the first 2 stages of clinical trials. So this is a very different way of treating MS than just trying to attack the immune system. But it also could be very important when it comes to preventing MS. EBV obviously plays a huge role, but how do we take that information and actually put it into the general population? We've seen a lot of anti-feeling about vaccinations when it's come to COVID. How are we actually going to get a population on board to vaccinate against the Epstein-Barr virus, which are probably only a few % of people will develop MS? How do we actually sell that to the general population? So these are sort of things that I think we'll have to work on. Maybe we need to kind of look at the risk factors and then kind of target a subset. So there's a lot of work kind of trying to go on to do that. But then, of course, it comes to prevention. How can we actually prevent people from getting MS? And of course, I mentioned earlier that low levels of vitamin D is a risk factor for developing MS. So we, at MS Australia, probably back about 2013, took that information and said, right, well, what happens if we give people at high risk of developing MS, and what happens if we give them vitamin D? So they recruited patients from both Australia and New Zealand, and we gave them different doses of vitamin D, with the whole theory that if low levels of vitamin D is a risk factor, what happens if we can fix it? But unfortunately, the results came out last year, and we didn't have any effect, even though we're giving some people a fairly large dose of vitamin D. But we need to keep working through some of these risk factors to really fully understand how MS is arising and actually how we can actually stop it. So I've labelled my next slide, Finding Cures, the Future is Happening, which might seem a little bit optimistic, but talking about remyelination. So we have the nerve fibres, the immune system attacks it, damages it. We can use treatment to kind of block that immune system very effectively, but that still leaves the damaged neuron, which is struggling to kind of communicate. So what happens if we can actually repair that damage? And so that was, I pointed out in the timeline in 2017, the kind of first proof of principle kind of in a kind of clinical trial trying to do that. And we've got a number of agents in clinical trials to actually try and improve that. And that has been over the space of probably the last 6 years, the actual possibility that we could reverse some of the damage. And I think when I first entered into the field, that was never really in our lexicon. We never really talked about actually reversing some of the damage. It's all about stopping, and so I think that's a very positive aspect. So really what I've done is just kind of whipped through kind of the 3 key areas which I think that the research is probably heading in the 3 areas that I think we probably should be heading in. And I appreciate there's a whole range of other research going on, and I did just cherry pick the 3 areas that I thought was most important. And on that note, I probably will stop boring you all and take any questions you may have. Stunned silence.
I have a question.
Yes.
I've had MS now for about 23, 24 years, and ever since I was diagnosed, I've always been told we've had about 4,000 people with MS. And still 24 years later, we've still got 4,000 people. And I just think, and when I've asked the question, it's been, it evens itself out, but I don't think that that's quite right. So it would be nice if we could get the study done where we had the correct statistics.
Yes, I actually think New Zealand is actually perfectly placed to actually have an MS registry, but unfortunately we don't. In Australia, we use a lot of prescription data to actually work out roughly where the populations are. But of course, in New Zealand, we're fairly limited, and of course, it usually is done at the kind of main hospitals like here in Christchurch or Dunedin, so we don't really get the kind of spread. So yeah, but I would think that the number is actually far higher than 4,000, especially when you look at studies overseas and in Australia where we see the rates increasing. So yeah.
What can we do at fixing that?
Fixing the rates, yeah. I think that's $1 million question. Of course, we tried vitamin D, that didn't work. It's happening too quickly to be changes in genetics. So the population hasn't really changed. It's really obviously some exposure that we're having. So it's actually trying to make sure we can work out what that is. Diet, of course, is one a lot of people point the finger at. And I appreciate a lot of people with MS often radically change their diet after a diagnosis. But actually, once again, I'm taking the Australian context, so we have better probably population data. 4% of the Australian population follow the Australian healthy eating guidelines. People want to be, and I'm not pointing out any diet and poo-pooing it, but some people want to be vegan, some people want to have meat only, some people, you can pretty much put a whole list in, but actually only 4% of people follow the healthy eating guidelines. And I don't think it's kind of so catchy when you kind of say, well, I'm changing my diet, I'm going to follow the healthy eating guidelines. So yeah, I think kind of we need to kind of explore that space a lot. But diet is a very challenging area to investigate.
How can we go about finding out the information who's got MS in New Zealand?
Big pardon, sorry?
How do we go about finding out how many people have got MS?
Yes, yeah, that is quite a challenge. What I would like to see is actually a lot of the neurologists who actually do collaborate to actually kind of put some numbers down of how many people they see with MS. Of course, not everybody with MS sees the neurologist, but it would help us kind of get a real feel to how many there is.
One of the hassles here that not every health board, for some reason or other, have never put MS base in the system. And many years ago, Tony Ryle, who was the Minister of Health, said that we're going to have one IT system across the country, and we're still waiting. And MS base here is only being used by Debbie Mason. And Waikato is actually using it across all their neurologists. And Wellington are trying, but haven't got it off the ground properly. So it's because of our IT systems.
So I'll just kind of probably elaborate a little bit on that. The word MS base was used, and actually was on one of my slides. MS base is actually a clinical database that started in Australia, and it started off just in Australia, but it's now spread worldwide. And I think there's a couple of 100,000 people with MS. So what happens is neurologists, when they see someone with MS, they'll go and record the data into this database. So it'll be what sort of treatments, what sort of symptoms were displayed, what the MRI results were. And so we've actually got a really good way of actually seeing what happens. So we can actually run virtual clinical trials comparing drugs to each other. And see whether the certain populations can actually do better under certain treatment regimes. The problem is that not all neurologists, especially here in New Zealand, actually use the system. Now, the challenge is, of course, a lot of the neurologists will have, or it's not just neurologists, a lot of healthcare professionals will have some sort of kind of digital patient record. So what they don't like is actually filling in two forms, but it's actually really valuable. And if all the neurologists would get on board with MS base, we would just have even more data. And being a bit of a data nerd, that is actually really, really valuable, and we can learn a lot from it. So yes, unfortunately, a lot of them cite workload because it is double entering of data. So.
Just a question from people watching online. Do you have any experience with fasting? And when it comes to a diet, if that's helpful? Do you know anything about that?
When it comes to diet, I probably answer quite cautiously. If diet is a way you can control your MS, but it doesn't necessarily mean across a wide range of people that these diets actually are helpful for a wide range of people. But if you find it helps for you, then go ahead. I always also suggest kind of seeing a registered dietitian to make sure you're not missing out on any vital food groups. Yes.
When you're on the drugs that you have, and they are supposed to stop you having, if you've got relapsing, they stop you from having relapses. And then after a certain length of time, the neurologist will say, you've been on it for so long, so now you're at the next stage, so you probably don't need the drug anymore. How would they know without giving you an MRI that you're not, it's not the drug that has been helping you, it's not just that you've moved to the next stage?
Yes, so there's probably two parts to that question. As you get older, your immune system actually kind of dies down a little bit, so you don't kind of have the high levels of inflammation. Of course, bearing in mind these drugs are the ones targeting inflammation. But also kind of there's been a whole body of evidence to suggest once you've moved into kind of the progressive stage that some of these drugs aren't going to be overly beneficial because the inflammation component has actually died down. So it probably will be around those lines that they're really going, the number of relapses and age as well. Yes?
Is there sort of any indication or evidence how long before that sort of age 30 to 40 diagnosis the actual damage to the nerves is starting to be done?
That's a really interesting question because, of course, we talk about the pre-drome. So there's probably a lot of people, and probably a lot of people in the room who have MS will probably realise that long before they actually had a diagnosis, or before they actually realised something was wrong, that there's probably symptoms that they have been experiencing. But of course, because everybody's disease course is very different, some people have rapid onset, rapid progression with lots of relapses. Other people just have one or two relapses every now and again. It probably is going to be very varied. But we usually do talk about the pre-drome being 5 to 10 years. Yes?
The situation of going to a neurologist, several years ago, my wife's had been diagnosed for 35 years now, and one wonders how long before that. But about 5, 6 years ago maybe, our doctor referred us to a neurologist, and without meaning to be in any way denigrating, I think I could have probably got as much information out of the dental nurse, because we really came away with no real answers at all. Whether there's been a progression in that time since, and then how long does it take you to get to a neurologist, and particularly one who knows enough about it.
Yes, that's a hard one, because neurology actually covers a whole range of diseases, and in New Zealand, I suppose we have a limited pool of neurologists, a very limited pool of neurologists who have to see every neurological condition. So they're probably not necessarily MS specialists. And I don't want to kind of bag the knowledge of our neurologists, but it is a very hard area to work in, and it's only really been the last couple of years that there's actually been a toolkit that they can actually use to treat people with MS. Interestingly, you do talk about a dentist. There's been a lot of studies over in Australia looking actually at the dental health of people with MS as kind of a way to actually monitor progression. So there is oral health does play an important role.
Okay. So really, if you're saying there's been an advancement in some neurologists' understanding, it would pay to go back and make another appointment.
Yes, I think, and a second opinion is always very important.
Thank you.
Yes.
What are you the most excited for moving forward with MS research? Like, what really are you like, yes, this is going to be good?
Remyelination, to be perfectly honest, like that to me does seem a bit like magic, to be perfectly honest. We have a lot of treatments, and I kind of think what we'll probably end up seeing is that we'll end up with probably taking a couple of medications, one to stop the immune attack, and another one to kind of help the myelin be repaired. And that really, like 5-10 years ago, we were not really even contemplating it at all. So that's what I'm most excited about. And that does have the ability, hopefully, to kind of actually repair some of the damage. And so that's what I'm most excited about. I will temper it. It's not going to be a silver bullet. It's not going to probably reverse long-term disabilities. But I think it's going to have a huge impact if it works.
About 10 years away, right?
I wish. Which is the annoying thing about timelines is you kind of do end up with kind of things that suddenly work, and so kind of boom, it could be you're banging your head against a brick wall, and then suddenly there's a breakthrough. So yeah, I'm not going to put a 10-year time frame on it.
And you'll bring this into fruition, and then you have to get past Farmac.
Yes. That is true. That is true. So very good.
Is it true that Australia is working on the remyelination?
Yes. And there's people all around the world working on remyelination. There's quite an active MS community that works quite well right across the world. So I know of at least four clinical trials in early stage in Australia looking at remyelination. Some of them have taken very different approaches. One down in Hobart is looking at what's called transcranial magnetic stimulation. So that's actually using magnets on the head, and that's in clinical trials, early stage clinical trials. So I think they've treated 20 people to date. So it'll be very interesting to see what that happens. There's another group in Monash who have got some what they call an orphan drug. So it's a drug that has been approved for a rare disease, which I think might have possibility, and so they're getting close to clinical trials as well. And there's about 2 others. So yeah, but they've got to work. I don't want to get people's hopes up. They do need to be shown to be efficient. But really, the kind of getting back to the excitement, like we wouldn't even been thinking about this 10 years ago. I put a time frame on it. Retrospectively. Yes.
There are obviously some criticisms, like how many pharmaceuticals are available in New Zealand, and also potentially the IT system and things like that. What is something, in your opinion, that MS patients and their support people could actually start doing to try and help this? Because I'm assuming you can't solve it all on your own.
That is true. I think, it's one of the reasons why I'm actually getting into politics, because I think actually we're actually failing New Zealanders, and I appreciate if I am successful getting into politics as a junior MP, I don't have very much influence. It will take time. But there was one patient advocacy group that put the most urgent medications for Farmac. They put the budget at $410 million a year. Now I'm not 100% sure of all the medications that were on that list, but I think there's probably a couple that I'd like to see for MS on there. So what actually kind of, a lot of people kind of talk about in New Zealand, say we're a small country, we can't afford it. But actually my argument is it actually takes an awful lot of money to kind of actually to look after people that have developed disabilities. It's actually cheaper to actually fund the medication. So my argument is we can't not afford it. The other thing people say, if it's important, the government will fund it. And once again, I'm not throwing any stones, but that's not happening. So that's really my long-term goal. Yes.
It sounds like you've got the political spectrum, you've got the data statistician spectrum, you've got the scientists, and you've got the medical profession. They've all got to work together. We need something that will gel.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've hit the nail on the head. But totally agree.
How do we fix it? I don't know.
Yeah, and it kind of comes back to the point over here. MS Base, we kind of need to kind of roll it out. In effect, it could act as a registry for New Zealand. but then we need IT systems to work together. And I appreciate IT systems as kind of something easy to throw around, but of course we need all the privacy for clinical data and things like that. So there is a few hurdles there, but we do need to. I don't think we should be giving up. I think we should be kind of trying all we can to kind of get it to work. There's that continuation?
Yeah, there's the other side here in New Zealand that MS neurologists have a yearly meeting in Queenstown. I don't know if you're aware of that at all. Have you been to one of those?
No, I haven't. There's a whole range of
I know a number of
meetings in Queenstown. That sounds bad. But there's a whole series of scientific ones. There's the neurologist. There's a molecular biology one. There's there is a series. Sorry, it's probably a better word.
There's a number of your researchers out of Australia have been to the MS neurologist meeting in Queenstown over the years.
Yes, that's true.
And internationally, other than Australia and New Zealand, scientists, a number of around the world have always come to that session too. But from going from there, the MS base thing was being promoted there. It has been very hard to get organisations or even the DHB here to get their IT people to put the MS base on the system for.
And I just interrupt with a bit there. I must admit I've had personal experience there because I was really impressed with the idea of MS based when Dr. Helmer
that's cool then.
Somebody, and I thought that was great. And then the neuro nurses at Christchurch Hospital started actually taking people's names for that neuro test. And I thought it was going to be amazing because we talked about having an app on your phone and actually do certain measurements and compare for yourself how your progress was. I'm one of those really odd people who's got primary progressive. So there's no drugs for me. And once they've done your initial MRI, they just leave you to wander on the world on your own. Because...
Did they give you a name for that app?
No, they just said it was going to be. And it never happened. That was the thing. I remember my latest neuro nurses meeting and she said, well, actually, the IT in Christchurch just didn't fit with it. MS-based changed their base, IT base, and it was gel with Christchurch and no one's ever got around to doing anything about it. So you start off with amazing intentions.
Well, actually, that infographic that I showed actually took off the name of what the project actually ended up being called. And it was actually called Informed. So it's actually currently still being coded down in Hobart. So I'm hoping it will come to New Zealand at some stage. But yeah, we're starting.
We need to reintroduce all the things.
So it's going to start off with members of the Australian MS longitudinal study. So these are people that we've been following for 20 years. So we actually know a lot of data from them already. So they're going to have first access to it. And so then there'll be a control population for then hopefully they'll release it to the rest of the world. But unfortunately, I'm no longer in charge of that project.
So just while I've got the audience, sorry, everything you've talked about was for remit and relaxing and progressive. When does that leave?
I appreciate I only kind of talked about very briefly mentioned the need for progressive MS. For that I apologise. It is. I appreciate that's probably a miss. Yes. So remyelination and also looking at retargeting EBV is really designed primarily for people with progressive MS. And what we'll see, and we'll see more of it, is it will become harder and harder for drugs to be approved for relapsing or remitting MS because there's already a battery. And so people, and a lot of people with progressive MS, rightfully so, feel left out, but it's not actually because of a lack of trying. There's been a lot of effort put in to try and find out the causes and drivers of progressive MS. And really, as I mentioned, a lot of the medications have come across from the cancer world. So that was kind of an easy win, so to speak. But for primary progressive and secondary progressive is a challenge. There's probably other disease processes going on, but there is work going on there, and it is believed that we could do remyelination progressive MS. I am, which I'm really excited about, but once again, I temper that excitement because we're not there yet.
There has been one done in New Zealand.
Yes, that is correct. Unfortunately, it wasn't overly successful. M126, no, something like that. Yeah, but it might be MS126.
It's
Yes.
sort of related to that progressive versus recurring MS and the sort of different risk factors. Is there kind of, I guess, the question or the answer to whether there's actually multiple unique pathways into what is the same pathology with the demyelination, and that actually you're trying to pin down like 3 or 4 different diseases, and that's why there's a range of things that work or don't work, or risk factors that show up sometimes and not other times.
Yes, and if you go to some MS conferences, that's a real. The naming and classification of different types of MS is very controversial. Some people say it's a spectrum of one disease. Other people say it's very distinct, different types of diseases. Some people kind of be a mixture between the two. We talk about gender, that three out of 4 people diagnosed will be female. When it comes to primary progressive MS, it's more 50-50. So there's obviously there's definitely a different driver to leading to progressive MS and the relapsing remitting MS. But then there's certain people that will actually refer to kind of progressive forms of MS versus relapsing forms of MS, but the rest of that actually there's a period in the two which probably both can be active. Classification is probably really important when it comes to getting drugs funded. Yes.
I don't want to belabor my point, but I just wanted to ask, is there a society, whether it's this one or could there be somewhere where we could gain information about which neurologists have perhaps greater specialisation towards MS rather than the general?
Yeah, I don't know whether the Canterbury, but MS New Zealand, I think has that data. What I would say is it's very interesting being kind of a neutral body when you're dealing with people with MS and dealing with neurologists. Often there's some neurologists that I would sometimes pull my hair out at, and others that I get on really well with. And it was really interesting to hear patients' perspective. Some would absolutely love one neurologist, and someone else says, "Oh, I couldn't stand that neurologist," and I'd go somewhere else. And you do have to have a good relationship with your neurologist, and that can be just down to the personal relationship rather than actually anything else.
I find my doctor knows nothing about MS.
Your GP? Yes. A lot of GPs will actually never encounter someone with MS.
That's right.
So of course, that's a challenge, and it's about kind of education.
And my wife's got Parkinson's. We managed to get an appointment with our neurologist, who also I'm under. I've never seen him for years. And I'm not on any medication. It annoys the shit out of me.
Yeah. Well, yeah, as I said, mind you, we have a very limited pool of neurologists here in New Zealand, but in Australia we always say go and get a second opinion if you're unhappy.
But how do you get hold of one?
Now, we are severely short of neurologists.
We are.
If you have primary or secondary progressive MS and you settle into a slow downhill, it sounds like there's not much point in going to see a neurologist anyway.
Yeah.
All they're going to do is monitor you and say, "Oh, you're not as good as you were last year." But you know that already.
Yes,
Facebook memories tell you.
I appreciate that's the point. There is medications coming through. I pointed out Mazin in Australia now for secondary progressive. It's not approved here, but there is things coming. There is complications, as you know. There's probably a whole range, and there's also symptom. You can have some of these medications do actually treat the symptoms, which may actually be beneficial to quality of life. So I won't totally rule it out. But
But at the moment in our current stage in New Zealand, going to see
your neurologist if you just have progressive MS. And you're probably better off going to see your GP for symptomatic relief of.
But I won't dissuade you from going to see a neurologist. You're right, a lot of GPs probably haven't, or just mentioned haven't come across someone with MS. But there are things that can be done for symptoms and things like that. So I wouldn't totally rule out going to a neurologist.
It's quite hard to bully your doctor to give you a referral, but it is possible. I've done it.
Yeah.
I think my doctor must be a little bit frightened because she would always refer me to my neurologist. Right, I'll just pass you on.
Who's your doctor?
Yes.
Do you have any knowledge about studies about why females are more susceptible?
Yeah, it's actually a big area of research going on. And also the other area that kind of is related to that is the effect of pregnancy on MS. And so that's a huge issue. Well, not a huge issue, sorry. It's a huge area of study because, of course, it gives an insight into female hormones and changes in female hormones. And during pregnancy, there seems to be protection from MS and from relapses. And so yeah, there's a lot of work going on there to try and understand what kind of causes that. And of course, in previous generations, people were told not to have children because they believed it was going to worsen their MS, and that's clearly not the case. Yes?
I've got primary progressive, and it started with optical neuritis, scratching at the back of the eye. I had it about a month ago, the same sort of scratching on the back of the eye again, and I thought another attack. I went to my doctor and he referred me to Dr. Mason, but she's away at the moment. So there was someone relieving, and he basically said, unless it's affected him drastically, don't worry about it.
Yeah. Well, you know, I can't really kind of comment on individual clinical cases, but yeah. But the thing is, I think any symptom needs to be checked out. But yeah, it's always surprising when people say things like that. Excellent. Yeah.
Thanks, Hamish. Well, that was very interesting. We certainly learned a whole heck of a lot, and good on you guys for all of those questions. I thought that they were very inquisitive and intelligent, and I felt like I learned equally as much in the Q&A portion as I did in the presentation portion, so good on you guys. Some things that are going to be coming up for us is we have some laughter yoga coming up again in July. We also have educational workshops, which will be some reading classes. We're just trying to put on some things that might ignite connection with lots of different people. We also have our peer support groups that are up and running, and we have a Wednesday specific to MS group that happens at 10:30, here at the Braintree, and you are all welcome to come and join in with that. We also, sorry to put you on the spot, but if Ingrid Robertson, if you could just raise your hand in the back. Ingrid Robertson and Gil Leonard have put together a community peer support group that meets monthly on a Saturday. So if you're also interested in getting more information, we can direct you into Ingrid's groups as well. And we're always open for feedback, and if you want something to be brought here, please let us know about it. But thank you so much for coming and supporting the keynote speaker series, and especially thank you so much to Dr. Hamish for coming out today. So great, thank you.